At the tender age of 11, Richard II ascended the English throne, inheriting a realm entrenched in foreign entanglements and conflicts, remnants of his grandfather Edward III's reign. In response to the Commons' plea, the Lords, acting on behalf of the king, established a permanent council of 9 members. It was decreed that during Richard's minority, parliamentary approval would be required for appointing key crown officials. Governance ostensibly bore the king's name, yet the true authority lay veiled within his uncles, notably the Duke of Lancaster, who effectively functioned as regent. Despite efforts to stabilize the realm, England remained embroiled in hostilities with France, Scotland, and Castile. Initially, securing funding for warfare posed little challenge to the ministers. However, by the 3rd year of Richard's reign, the financial strain, particularly from campaigns in Brittany, necessitated additional support. Various taxation methods fell short, leading to discontent among the Commons. In response, Parliament reluctantly agreed to levy a novel tax of 3 groats per person above 15 years old, with provisions for equitable distribution in urban areas. Discontent brewed further when tax collection sparked a rebellion, threatening both the king's safety and the government's stability. Across Europe, a simmering discontent was palpable in the populace, fueled by societal advancements, spreading knowledge, escalating taxation, and the enduring scars of recent wars. The downtrodden, inspired by tales of Flemish defiance and Parisian uprisings, sought to break free from the shackles of feudalism. At the end of the 14th century in England, the plight of villains, still bound to the land and subject to arbitrary taxation and servitude, reached a boiling point. Attempts at emancipation were met with resistance, leading to organized defiance among villains, buoyed by the teachings of Wycliffe and a burgeoning sense of egalitarianism. The spark that ignited rebellion came with the realization of tax shortfall. Investigations were launched into collector misconduct, but in Essex, defiance turned to violence as insurgents, led by the enigmatic Jack Straw and Wat Tyler, struck fear into authorities. Similar sentiments echoed in Kent, where a brutal incident catalyzed widespread revolt. From the suburbs to the countryside, insurrection spread like wildfire. Leaders emerged, preaching equality and promising liberation from oppression. John Ball, an itinerant preacher, became a voice of defiance, rallying thousands to challenge the established order, symbolized by their intent march on London. By letters and messengers, the knowledge of these proceedings was carefully spread throughout the neighboring counties. Everywhere, the people had been informed and prepared, and within a few days, the flame of rebellion spread from the southern coast of Kent to the right bank of the Humber. The insurgents followed a consistent pattern in all places, pillaging the manors of their lords, destroying houses, burning court rolls, and executing every justice, lawyer, and juror who fell into their hands. They swore allegiance to King Richard and the common people, rejecting any king by the name of John and opposing all taxes except 15ths, the traditional tallage paid by their ancestors. The council members were astonished by the sudden rise and swift spread of the insurrection. Bewildered by their fears and lack of information, they were unsure whom to trust or what actions to take. The first encounter with the rebels on Blackheath was by the Princess of Wales, the king's mother, returning from a pilgrimage to Canterbury. She skillfully negotiated her safety, using her charm to secure protection from the leaders and respect from their followers with a few kisses. Allowed to rejoin her son, King Richard, along with his cousin Henry, Earl of Derby, Simon, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Chancellor, Sir Robert Hales, Master of the Knights of St. John and Treasurer, and about 100 sergeants and knights, had left Windsor Castle for the greater security of the Tower of London. The following morning, the king, aboard his barge, descended the river to address the insurgents' petitions. 10,000 rebels, with 2 banners of St. George and 60 pennons, awaited his arrival at Rotherhithe. However, their intimidating shouts and rough appearance caused his attendants to hastily retreat, taking advantage of the tide. Tyler and Straw, angered by this, led their men into Suffolk, where they destroyed the Marshalsea and the king's bench houses. Another group breached the Archbishop's palace at Lambeth, burning its contents and chancery records. The following morning they were allowed to enter the city in small groups according to their townships. Joined by the populace, they first indulged themselves at the expense of the wealthier inhabitants before beginning their destructive work. They razed Newgate, freeing the prisoners, looted and destroyed the splendid Savoy palace belonging to the Duke of Lancaster, and burned the temple with its books and records. A detachment was sent to set fire to the Knights Hospitallers' house at Clerkenwell, recently constructed by Sir Robert Hales. To demonstrate their lack of interest in personal gain, they issued a proclamation forbidding anyone to keep any of the plunder. This prohibition was rigorously enforced. Plates were hammered into pieces, precious stones were crushed, and a rioter caught hiding a silver cup in his bosom was thrown into the river along with his prize. They demanded loyalty from everyone they encountered, executing those who did not pledge allegiance to King Richard and the Commons. Their main targets for cruelty were the Flemish immigrants. They dragged many Flemings out of churches and streets, beheading them with triumph and exultation. As night fell, they dispersed through the streets, indulging in debauchery. During this night of fear and uncertainty, the Princess of Wales held a council with the ministers in the Tower. The king's uncles were absent, and though the garrison could possibly defend the Tower, it was too weak to quell the insurgents. They resolved to attempt to pacify the rebels through promises and concessions. In the morning, Tower Hill was crowded with rebels demanding the heads of the Chancellor and Treasurer. In response, a herald ordered them to Mile End, where the king would meet their demands. The gates were opened and Richard, with a few unarmed attendants, rode forward. The crowd followed, and at Mile End he found himself surrounded by 60,000 petitioners. Their demands were summarized to 4 points: the abolition of slavery, reduction of land rent, freedom of trade in all fairs and markets, and a general pardon for past offences. A charter embodying these demands was drawn up for each parish and township. 30 clerks worked overnight to produce enough copies, which were sealed and delivered the next morning. The majority, composed mostly of people from Essex and Hertfordshire, left, carrying the king's banner as a sign of his protection. However, Tyler and Straw harboured more ambitious plans. In the king's absence, they led 400 men into the Tower. They captured several important figures, including the Archbishop and Sir Robert Hales, and promptly executed them. With no resistance encountered, they thoroughly searched the Tower, even invading the princess's private quarters and frightening her. She fainted and was carried by her ladies to safety across the river. Her new residence became the Royal Wardrobe in Carter Lane. The king joined his mother at the wardrobe, and the next morning, as he rode through Smithfield with 60 horsemen, encountered Wat Tyler at the head of 20,000 insurgents. 3 different charters had been sent to that demagogue, who contemptuously refused them all. As soon as he saw Richard, he made a sign to his followers to halt and boldly rode up to the king. A conversation immediately began. Tyler, as he talked, affected to play with his dagger. At last he laid his hand on the bridle of his sovereign, but at that moment, Walworth, the Lord Mayor, jealous of his design, plunged a short sword into his throat. Tyler spurred his horse, rode about a dozen yards, fell to the ground, and was dispatched by Robert Standish, one of the king's esquires. The insurgents, who witnessed the transaction, drew their bows to revenge the fall of their leader, and Richard would inevitably have lost his life had he not been saved by his own intrepidity. Galloping up to the archers, he exclaimed, "What are you doing, my lieges? Tyler was a traitor. Come with me and I will be your leader." Wavering and disconcerted, they followed him into the fields of Islington, where a force of 1,000 men-at-arms, collected by the Lord Mayor and Sir Robert Knowles, hastened to protect the young king. The insurgents, falling on their knees, begged for mercy. Many royalists demanded permission to punish them for their past excesses, but Richard firmly refused, ordered the suppliants to return to their homes. On the southern coast, the excesses of the insurgents reached as far as Winchester, on the eastern to Beverley and Scarborough. If we reflect that in every place they rose about the same time and uniformly pursued the same system, we may discover reason to suspect that they acted under the direction of some acknowledged though invisible leader. The nobility and gentry, intimidated by the hostility of their tenants and distressed by contradictory reports, sought security within the fortifications of their castles. The only man who behaved with promptitude and resolution was Henry Spencer. the young and warlike Bishop of Norwich. In the counties of Norfolk, Cambridge, and Huntingdon, tranquility was restored and preserved by this singular prelate, who successively exercised the offices of general, judge, and priest. Clad in complete armor, he always led his followers to the attack. After the battle, he sat in judgment on his prisoners, and before execution he administered to them the aids of religion. As soon as the death of Tyler and the dispersion of the men of Kent and Essex were known, thousands became eager to display their loyalty. Knights and esquires from every quarter poured into London to offer their services to the king. At the head of 40,000 horse, he published proclamations revoking the charters of manumission he had granted, commanding the villains to perform their usual services and prohibiting illegal assemblies and associations. In several parts, the Commons threatened to renew the horrors of the late tumult in defense of their liberties, but the approach of the royal army dismayed the disaffected in Kent. The loss of 500 men induced the insurgents of Essex to sue for pardon, and numerous executions in different counties effectively crushed the spirit of resistance. Among the sufferers were Lister and Westbrook, who had assumed the title and authority of kings in Norfolk and Suffolk, and Straw and Ball, the itinerant preachers, who have been already mentioned and whose sermons were supposed to have kindled and nourished the insurrection. When the Parliament met, the two houses were informed by the Chancellor that the king had revoked the charters of emancipation, which he had been compelled to grant to the villains, but at the same time wished to submit to their consideration whether it might not be wise to abolish the state of bondage altogether. The minds of the great proprietors were not, however, prepared for the adoption of so liberal a measure, and both Lords and Commons unanimously replied that no man could deprive them of the services of their villains without their consent, that they had never given that consent and never would be induced to give it, either through persuasion or violence. The king yielded to their obstinacy and the charters were repealed by authority of Parliament. The Commons next deliberated and presented their petitions. They attributed the insurrection to the grievances suffered by the people from the purveyors, who were said to have exceeded all their predecessors in insolence and extortion, the rapacity of the royal officers in the Chancery and Exchequer, and the courts of King's Bench and Common Pleas, the banditti, called maintainers, who in different counties supported themselves by plunder and, arming in defense of each other, set at defiance all the provisions of the law, and the repeated aids and taxes, which had impoverished the people and proved of no service to the nation. To silence these complaints, a commission of inquiry was appointed. The courts of law and the king's household were subjected to regulations of reform, and severe orders were published for the immediate suppression of illegal associations. But the demand of a supply produced a very interesting altercation. The Commons refused, on the ground that the imposition of a new tax would goad the people to a second insurrection. They found it, however, necessary to request of the king a general pardon for all illegal acts committed in the suppression of the insurgents, and received for answer that it was customary for the Commons to make their grants before the king bestowed his favors. When the subsidy was again pressed on their attention, they replied that they should take time to consider it, but were told that the king would also take time to consider of their petition. At last they yielded. The tax upon wool, wool fells, and leather was continued for 5 years, and in return a general pardon was granted for all loyal subjects who had acted illegally in opposing the rebels, and for the great body of the insurgents, who had been misled by the declamations of the demagogues.